So what I was saying, that this session builds on Mike's previous input around insights discovery and the color energies, and that is built on Jung's psychological theories of our subconscious drivers that in turn drive our behavioral preferences. So we can have that in the background. It's a useful start point. And he also linked that to the change curve, or he may have referred to it as the Kubler-Ross curve, which emanated from studies in bereavement that apply to the way that all of us respond to different types of change, how the initial impact drives into shock, and we go through that sort of bereavement curve, disavowing what's actually happened, and then eventually go through blame all the way through to acceptance and rebuild our psychological strength to deal with new situations. So just with those two pieces of information in the background, I'm going to build on that and extend our theorizing into the way that people function and create joint behaviors in organizations and joint assumptions. And the reason why, and the why is the important part about this, and this comes from some of Jung's own theorizing, is that, and I truly believe it, if we are unable to tap into our subconscious drivers, and I'm extending that whether at individual level or a collective level, then we don't understand the impact of those unconscious drivers on our individual and collective behaviors. And that means any sense of control is delegated to chance or fate, which clearly in a modern society and living and working in fast-paced organizations is not acceptable for ourselves and for the people around us. So let's have a look and see if we can overlay what Mike started, the journey Mike started, and start thinking about how collectively we manage and deal with change. I'd go back to Mike's offer, which is we're not going to solve anything today. We're opening up a discussion. If you individually or collectively want to revisit this material or deepen your learning into organizational change, then we are more than happy to have other sessions as next year starts to open up. In a way, Alison has kind of set the agenda, because a few of the words I wrote down as she was speaking, uncomfortable, communication, anxiety, inertia. Well, those are all the fabric that we're going to try and weave and understand in organizational change, because they're replete at every stage of organizational change. So let's just focus for a second or two on some of the points of feedback that we had, where people in the organization had expressed curiosity about underlying issues that don't always get surfaced, and maybe asking how we can surface some of those issues. The confusing nature of change that leads to uncertain destinations, and a bit of clarity about that. Organizational change is often confusing, and it often leads to an uncertain destination. I'll come back and I'll revisit that, but that is not unusual. Outcomes are often not those that were intended. Well, if we think of this as a mapping exercise, and we draw up a map, if we're looking to navigate in a strange land, we kind of want to know where we're going, but how we get there will be an iterative process of visiting different parts of the terrain, and sometimes taking deviations. And sometimes we cross a river that we weren't expecting, or climb a mountain range that we didn't know was going to be there. And organizational change and mapping change is quite a lot like that. We have to be versatile, and we don't always get the results that we anticipate, or end up in the destinations we thought we were heading for. Communication, I'll talk a lot about communication. If I was working with a group of executive MBA students, all of whom are ready on the first day, I've given the first 3 critical points for leading and managing change. I said, I'd like you to write these down. Number 1, communication. So then scribble that down. Number 2, communication. they don't bother with the third one because they know it's communication. And it really is that important. And again, I'll dig deeper in that as we go along. So it's a great point. It's been made by Alison. It was also made by people in the organization who gave us some feedback. The potential for holding on to a sense of identity and purpose that can be threatened because, we may have done really well. Why are we changing? And are we changing the purpose of and function of the organization? Does that mean that I have a new sense of identity? And that's that disturbance that comes from the individual sense of change. So we'll have a little bit of a look about that as well. I brought this slide back into the mix because of some of the feedback we'd had, and this was sent out to you as an earlier stage, and you may or may not have had time to have a look at this. This is a slide by Greiner, who was looking at how organizations grow and develop, and then the typical, stereotypical stages that they go through as they change. And I'm going to use this as part of the illustration for change. So if we take, as a matter of fact, that organizations tend to grow over a linear process of years, and they go from young organizations and they start to mature, and quite often they grow from small to large. The one thing we do know is that change is on a continuum. The world does not stand still. Whether it's our private lives or our business lives, nothing stays the same. So there's always going to be a continuum of change going from bottom left to top right. And what Greiner was suggesting is that there are certain things, certain challenges that will create change and confusion and stress in the system. That's part of the growing pains, if you will. So when we start to introduce creativity, then there's potentially a conflict for leadership and direction. When we then start to apply direction, then there's sometimes a conflict with autonomy. These are in the early stages of organizational development. When we start talking about control, there's a sense of potential loss of delegation. So these counterpoints work their way through the channels, and that's just on one way of measuring change in organizations. That's just based on size and time. Overlay that with other adaptive change. Adaptive change is change that we've decided, or people in the organization decided to overlay. And we have other periods of stress and friction where things are, all the balls seem up in the air. And then overlay a further set of issues that are externally driven. They come out of nowhere sometimes, left field. We never saw them coming, but they're landed on our lap, and now we've got to deal with them. So you've now got 3 lots of change to deal with, some of which can appear really, really quickly and be quite traumatic. If we're not careful, it becomes one long zigzag. And I guess, having had a quick briefing earlier today from Mike, some of us in, I say room, I'm talking about globally here on this call, may feel that life is a bit of a zigzag. It's a lot of stuff to take on board. It feels very stressful. It feels very confusing. And that, in the sense of good management and leadership of change, can be problematic if we allow it to emanate for too long. Mike? So I mentioned that change is the continuum, so change happens. The skill is to provide continuity and change. So individually and collectively, some of the change that we're dealing with is non-negotiable. However, what we do need to have a look at is how, through our values, how through our behaviors, we can build in opportunities for stability and continuity. If it's all about change, it becomes chaos and the world around us crumbles. We have to be able to build in the balance point. We're overloaded sometimes with the stress of change. Particularly leaders need to look at that and be sensitive to how people are responding, how much energy they've got, where their emotional focuses are, and building continuity. You won't get rid of change. You won't get rid of the need for continuity and change. And the real skill, and I have to say, around the leaders of the organizations or the strategists, if that isn't built into a plan, then we need to intervene to give people the opportunity to pause and refresh before going again. This links back to part of the concern that was suggested in some of your feedback, in that we often end up in a place we hadn't expected, or we encountered obstacles we weren't expecting. This wasn't the world that was described before we set out on this journey, and that is a polemic, but it's true that life is understood backwards, but must be lived forward. This comes from Kierkegaard, Danish philosopher. If you think about that, you don't actually know what life is going to be like until you've lived it. But we can't live life in the rearview mirror. But that is, in a sense, the beguiling feature of planning change. The assumption is we know what's going to happen in the future. And actually, we need to hold that in a more liberal sense. We need to hold that as an understanding of ambition, realizing that the change necessary will often take us to areas we hadn't anticipated. And it's only when we pause and we look back, and this is the purpose of the Tensense diagnostic, that we can actually reflect where have we come from in order to then plausibly think, how might we get where we need to go? But it's not a failing that we don't actually know where we've got to until we've gone past the point. What we're trying to do is close that timeline and get feedback as quickly as possible after events so that we can learn for the future. But understanding will always follow action. If you want to read a bit more about it, this is opening up a list of questions. So deliberately, in a way, these are the first 4 of 8 steps to leading change. This comes from John Cotter, a tenured professor at Harvard. Some of you may have read his earlier work on leading change. His seminal book was called Leading Change. What he did, he laid out a cluster of steps, not necessarily linear in terms of they must be 1 to 8, but stages that can actually help drive through change. The first 4, when we're in the flux of change, and this slide was also introduced because of the context of your organization at the moment, tended to line us up with where we need to be thinking. What are the realities? So number 1, establishing a sense of urgency. This may already be embedded, but we have to maintain momentum based on the realities of the market that we're trying to work within. Identifying and discussing crisis, potential crisis, or major opportunities. All those things need to be live and understood in an emergent and growing organization. We need to do this together. The pronoun needs to be we, not I. Even if you've got the most charismatic and powerful leader, he or she cannot flourish unless they're willing to embrace the pronoun we. So we all need to form guiding coalitions, people who are prepared to put their shoulder and lean into issues and drive solutions together. So assembling a group of people in order to drive a change effort. This doesn't mean a team. This, for me, is a collective effort that we're all involved in one form or another. And the encouragement should be that we all share the challenge and all share the responsibility. Number 3, creating a vision. It's really, really important that we have an understanding of why we're doing this. What is the purpose of this organization? How can we justify taking some of the knocks that organizational change presents? Why is it worth that energy? And developing strategies for achieving that vision. So the plans have to be linked to the real world of individual and collective psychology and responses to change. And come back to communication. I said I'd come back to communication. And I'm going to show you another slide in a second or two. the critical feature always is communication. Just bear with me a second while I take a sip of water. When Mike shared the change curve with you, Kubler-Ross curve, I don't know whether he brought this point to bear, but collectively it is undoubtedly true. When you have people in an organizational sense who are going through the trauma of change, where the emotion is high, you are going to get that sort of dipping where we have this sense of we're in the morass, we're in the weeds, and we've got to get out of it. Well, whether it's individually or collectively, the better the communication, the more frequent the communication, the easier the transition will be. The impact of the change curve can be moderated, it can't be taken away. So if we think that about life-changing individual events when we go to professional counselors, they can't take away grief, but they can help reframe it and assuage some of the more destructive elements that can impact on people's lives. So communicate. And if for those of us from time to time who are in leadership positions of leadership, don't ever get drawn into the thought, well, I've got nothing worth saying. If you've got nothing worth saying, saying that alone at least allows people to know I haven't missed anything. Or have you got anything to say? Collectively, what are you thinking at the moment? That in its own right is just as important as conveying the latest missive from head office. So if your leaders aren't giving you that sort of feedback, ask for it. Alison was very upfront at the beginning of this talk. If I'm failing you, or if I'm doing something you don't agree with, tell me. And having known Alison for some years and having had feedback from Mike, particularly about the relationship in different organizations, that is something which he is extremely ready to receive. If you aren't hearing enough, call out. We need more communication. The journey is uncertain. We don't know what's happening. We need more regular feedback for how the organization is doing. Mike? So when Cotter laid out his the mandate for his book, Leading Change, it was very successful, made him an awful lot of money. And then he wrote another book, which was equally successful. So he gave you the first steps for leading change, and he wrote another book, Why Change Fails, which actually, surprisingly, was the corollary of the first book. But the most pivotal point, why transformation efforts often fail, under communicating the vision, under communicating the why. And those organizations that fall in the trap of thinking this is a Gantt chart, have we sent out the minutes of the meeting? Has the defined leader made the right comment to the right groups of people? Have we got the newsletters and the memos lined up? Miss the point entirely. And the point about human psychology is that we relate to people on a one-to-one basis. And good leaders are great in transmitting communication. It makes it sound as though that person is talking to me and feels that I'm important. So we need people who have responsibility with their managers or leaders to walk the talk. Nothing undermines change more than wrong behaviors by important people. We say one thing and we do another. Just as a brief edit on this, I was working in the British National Health System some years ago, working for a regional chief executive whose mandate was that we work on an equal footing with each other. Everyone in the organization is as important as the other. We want 100% commitment. So day two, I drove into the car park. I noticed one car, the car park was full, but I noticed there was one car parked in the disabled parking. I happened to know who it was, but for effect, I gave the belief I didn't know. Went into the seminar. We had the preambles, and I asked whose vehicle was it parked in the disabled bay. And of course, it was the chief executive. Now, everybody in the organization knew what was happening, and that had become part of the embedded behavior. So the lesson there is, one, don't do it, But two, if you don't think that people in your organization haven't got a very acute sense of what you say and what you do, and they have to be joined at the hip, then you don't really have the right to be a leader or manager in this organization. You have to have that continuity. It has to be the right behaviors, and it has to be the right mandate, and the two have to be joined up. So communication takes a number of different forms, and it can be pretty sophisticated, but it needs to be applied with skill and with self-knowledge. And it's received in different ways. I mentioned maps earlier on. We can think of organizations in the same way that I used to climb mountains. I haven't done so for some time. I wasn't at the level of explorer, so I wasn't looking for new mountains. I was on the shoulders of other people who had already gone up the same mountain. But at the extreme, you have mountaineers who are looking to climb unclimbed faces, taking quite unusual risks. Well, we can look across into organizations and we can see that in extreme, we have strategists who may start up organizations or may buy organizations and develop new theories or new products and new services, and quite often take large financial risks. And the thinking between both is they take risks in order to get somewhere reached. And in organizations, we can look at using the travel and the tourist metaphor alongside explorers to understand that different people in organizations have different needs and have different mandates. So in the same way we can have explorers and strategists who have different needs, we can have travelers, people that have been around the world a couple of times. They know how to go into airports, they know how to navigate in foreign countries. Implementers might be seen as the managers in organizations who've got experience in working in 2 or 3 organizations. They know how to communicate, they know how things work. So the travelers can be the implementers. And the tourists, that's not meant as a negative. The tourists are the people that want to know where they're going, when they're going to get there. They want the tour rep to guide them. They want to know that most of the heavy lifting has been taken out of the equation for them. And people who have perhaps recently joined in an organization, to some extent, want that unraveling done for them to help them move into the organization. Not everybody is at the same stage of development in an organization, whether or not they're leaders, whether or not they're departmental heads. We're at different stages and we need different levels of communication. So this is a reminder that we all have different needs for communication. If my gig is blue sky thinking, okay, that's great. But the trap is if I'm leading an organization, I make the assumption that everybody else needs the same. No, that needs to be unpacked, and it needs to be unpacked quite often by the middle of the organization who have to take that blue sky thinking and then make it manageable and understandable. So we each need the communication repackaging into terms that make sense for us and are relevant to what we're doing in the organization. It isn't a one size fits all. Quite interestingly, we had a couple of comments about issues that were hidden under the surface. Ed Schein, who I think is still alive, American eminent organizational psychologist, came up with this model. A lot of what happens is like an iceberg. There are social norms, and we quite often just let life carry on. And yet under the surface, particularly during times of stress and change, there are assumptions, fears and past experiences that don't get surfaced. They can be surfaced, but it needs some sort of attention. We need to make space so that people are able and willing to explore areas of concern. So just team level conversations. Pulse checks, well, you're kind of doing that anyway with the diagnostic that we apply through Tensense, which is great. It gives you a point of communication. If neither of those are getting where you need to get to, somebody from the outside, third-party facilitation of focus groups can help. But it's wrong of us in organizations to assume that everything we see at the top, the 1/9 of the iceberg, is all that actually is going on. It's not. It's the other 8/9 that are often unspoken and unseen. So thank you for the question. Yes, it's correct, and more so in the process of change. We're going to show a very short 2.5-minute video after this piece. And this is just to bring to life, if you could, respectfully, if you could give your attention to the video. It's very simple, but the point it's making is that we can get trapped by our own beliefs and making assumptions about previous relationships and applying them into the current situation, or the way that previous situations have been managed and applying them to the current situation. And that often becomes disruptive, because actually change, take that notion, means that the next situation is likely to be somewhat different. The next point of rapport is likely to be different. The purpose of somebody coming into my room can't be assumed. We have to find out skillfully, if we're to move forward in organizations, by not inferring past events and dragging them into the present. So just a 2.5-minute quick video.
Conflict is natural. Different personalities, communication styles, or a lack of appreciation of different perspectives can all result in tension. If not managed properly, this can cause disruptive behaviours and lead to potentially preventable issues. Our beliefs, how we see the world around us, and the assumptions that we make can all affect our communication and the level of conflict that we and others experience. Let's explore how we can test our assumptions to get better outcomes. You're working on a project and need help and information from Mary, so you send her an email. When she doesn't respond, you leave her a voicemail, or 2, or 3. You remember the last time that you worked together with Mary and that you clashed. So you conclude that she is avoiding your communications. As the days roll by, you convince yourself that Mary is trying to sabotage you. In fact, as you recall, she never liked you. Soon, you start looking for examples of how she's trying to make you look bad, and you decide that you can't stand her either. The next time that you see Mary, you blank her, and soon other teammates notice that the communication has completely broken down between you. Wait a minute, let's climb down that ladder. It's really important to take a step back and ask yourself some questions about how we got here. A great starting point is to ask, what's the story that I'm telling myself? What was the observable data? Do we agree on it? What assumptions did I make? What conclusions did I draw? And how did that influence my actions? We must check these and invite others to test them too. By reflecting, we can become more aware of our own thinking and reasoning. By explaining, we can make our thinking more visible to others and test our assumptions and conclusions. And through respectful inquiry and non-judgmental questions, Mary, I notice you haven't returned my emails. We can gain insight into others' thought processes. The challenge for coaching is how we surface the differences in our thinking in a way that allows productive discussion and dialogue. The ladder of inference helps us understand how we can lead ourselves into making assumptions, and more importantly, how we can come back down and get to the real meaning of what's going on.
So this is our final slide. If you focus on the right-hand side, the individual, this is an extrapolation of the change curve, or Kubler-Ross. So what I've done here is drawn across from the right-hand side. We've now got the left-hand side, which is joining us. So on the organizational side, things can happen in our environment and life can feel pretty tough. And I would imagine that for a number of people on this call, life doesn't feel great and it feels pretty tough at the moment. Whether it's vocalized or not, we get a sense of negativity. It's quite normal. Whether it's rational, that's for the individual to decide, but it's perfectly normal. And we get to a point of, we've got to do something about this. As we go down that sort of slide and look across to the individual, it's the same sort of shock, denial, life gets tough. Some of that irrationality kicks in, the emotions certainly spark off, and we get to the bottom of that trough, and we've got to get ourselves back out of it. We've got to get ourselves back out of it. So individually and collectively, we regain the competence and add on the experience, which takes us to a higher level. So the left-hand side is what we're talking about today in terms of what are the best methods of getting us individually and collectively through the tough times of change. And the one point I'd like you to take away is that central thesis around communication. You've had it unpacked in a number of different ways, but whatever position you are in the organization, you have the absolute right to question the validity and the appropriateness of the communication around the performance issues in the organization, around the trauma of change, in order to get a more productive and beneficial output. So you're doing it for good, you're doing it for purpose, and that helps you and it helps other people. And for leaders on the call, heads of department on the call, it's an added responsibility to not make the assumption that everything is crystal clear, everything will follow a linear pathway and pattern and plan. And thirdly, events that you've seen or experienced in the past will replay today in the same way. They won't, whether it's relationships or whether it's events. So all of us all the time need to challenge and refresh what's the story here, and therefore collectively, how do we, pronoun we, move forward.